Hey everyone, welcome to week 3. This week we're looking at the power of archives. A couple of themes for this week that span across the articles. Power and interface, obviously. Also 3 additional themes to keep in mind. Objectivity, identity, and transparency. A few preview notes on the readings relevant to these themes. I'm riffing off some quotes I've pulled out from the articles. I'm not going to read the quotes to you. I'm mostly paraphrasing and adding stuff in. But I wanted just to sort of highlight a couple of bits that I think have really well-phrased formulations of things we need to be keeping in mind in terms of archives. So you'll recognize the language that you hear. It'll be very familiar when you go into the readings or vice versa. And that's on purpose. I hope that resonance is good. First theme, objectivity. Building on a theme we've already gotten into, both articles are reacting to the common perception that archives are harbors of truth, that they provide a clear window into the past. I hope it's becoming clear, even before this week, that there is no clear, objective way of accessing any objective past that's happened. It's just not possible. For lots of reasons, theoretical ones that we'll go into sort of gradually as the course unfolds. I just want to make sure it's obvious at this point that we're not looking through a clear window. When we go into the archive and trying to look into the past, we're not looking through a clear window. It's an old, unevenly frosted window. It has some tiny holes in it where you can see really clearly through it into the past and get a really good glimpse of something. There's other spots that are completely opaque. You can't see through it all. It has paint on it, different colors, so it colors what you see on the other side. So there's lots of distortions, there's lots of misperceptions, there's some clarity, and there's a general sense. Just like when you look through a frosted window, you can kind of see things that are going on the other side. But it's highly mediated. Our access to the past is highly mediated, entirely mediated through the archive. And precisely because the nature of the archive is not an objective reflection of the past, it has serious consequences, not just for historians that are trying to use it and write books about history, but for administrative accountability and citizen rights and collective memory, historical knowledge, all of which are shaped tacitly, quietly, subtly, invisibly, sometimes unconsciously, maybe usually unconsciously, but always profoundly by the naturalized, largely invisible and rarely questioned power of archives to shape how we access the past and how we use it to understand, justify the present, and shape the future. So let's see archives. This is what the articles are really trying to do for today. Let's see archives as agents in shaping our understanding of the past. Let's make sure we're not seeing them as kind of some subset of reality that we can go and then talk about, right? It's actively shaping and creating identity. And now whether we consider archives or archivists as active or passive shapers of our sense of history is up for debate. We could spend the whole semester talking about that. We won't. What matters is that there is an agency there. There is a direct shaping of how we understand the past and ourselves through what is and isn't in the archive, and those are very complicated processes to determine what goes in and what doesn't archive. That's what the articles are describing. For this week, you've already gotten a sense of that. Now we get some more detail. Second theme I want to talk about is identity. Whether conscious of it or not, archivists are major players. Archives and archivists together are major players in the business of identity politics. Archivists appraise, collect, preserve the scaffolding on which notions of identity are built. If you want to know who you are, where you come from, you're going to go to ancestry.com or something like that. Figure out where you are. Where did you come from? What were your people like? Right? How are you going to do that? Well, historical record. What was saved in the archives? That creates your identity. That's all you can know. All the other stuff that does go into your identity and your history and your heritage and so on, a lot of that has been completely filtered out. Maybe on purpose, maybe accidentally, unclear. But it's not there. There's a lot of stuff you just can't know. So notions of identity are confirmed and justified because they come from historical documents, which have a sort of an authority to them. And they become evidence these historical documents, the archive becomes evidence of the truth of the stories that we want to tell about ourselves when we can find it in the archive. And of course, a lot of people aren't in archives. We should keep a focus on the fact that one of the main facets of power that we're interested in this week in terms of archival power is very closely tied to identity, I was just talking about, and exerts a tremendous amount of social control. So power over the documentary record, this is both physical artifacts, documents, digital facsimiles, stuff you find online, born digital sources, doesn't matter. Power over the documentary record, the historical record, thereby provides power over the collective memory, historical identity, and therefore status of especially marginalized members of society. Women, non-whites, gays and lesbians, children, these are all listed in the article, which I'm going through this particular list. Lower classes, the poor, prisoners, non-literate people. The archive presents a tremendous amount of power over their representation and integration into the meta-narratives of history. And this is to say that they're largely not there. They're largely invisible. I want us to keep in mind, too, for the purposes of this class, the parallels between societal data, all the data that's being collected about us, that we're providing, that governments collect, census records, use records of buses. I mean, all the data we're generating about society are like archives in the power they yield. Okay, data that's collected about people and what they're doing and how they're using government services and how they're using private, apps and so on. All that data goes into administrative and legal decisions. It helps us understand the fiscal workings of governments, corporations, and individuals. It affects public policy decisions. And too often, collected data, just like archives have done, and we've been reading about, and we'll read about this week, marginalize people who aren't like the people who are collecting the data. They become invisible. The power of archives that we're reading about this week, we're going to apply in this class to the power of data and algorithms later. So when you're reading about the history of archives and power relationships and identity and so on, don't file that away in history of archives in your brain, right? Keep that front and center of this is what's going to really anchor a lot of the stuff that we read in the second half of the class that will never mention the history of the archive. So it's very important that we keep this in our head. It'll be tempting to think that the ability to save information, made easier through born digital records and cheap storage, alleviate many of these problems. Well, if we can save everything, right? And we really can. If we can save everything, aren't we being more objective? Aren't we sort of diminishing the power of the archives or the distortions of the archives because we can save more stuff? Technology is making access easier, ability to save things. Sure, in some ways it's absolutely making things easier, but it's creating a whole range of new problems too. And we're going to address these over the next couple weeks as we think about how archives have been changing in the last 30 years because of digital media technology. I'll return to technology problems in terms of interface in just a second. One point about technology and archives to make now, though, is that understanding archival history, as we're doing in the first part of this class, might be more important in the digital age than it ever was. We've seen how historically archives have always been manipulated to reflect, people in power and sort of justify certain kinds of policies and so on. But in the digital age, there's sort of new concerns about the archive that are very distinct from anything we've seen before. Think about Trevor Owens' definitions of archives. He has a whole range of them there, but he has a couple, like personal archiving on your desktop or saving a website as an archive. How much does our modern usage of archive come through those sort of personal experiences where you can just take stuff on your desktop or your computer somewhere and you can just put it in a folder. And you think to yourself, I'm archiving this, which means just to kind of get it out of the way. It's a place to stash stuff out of view that you don't want to get rid of. So how much does the fact that we can all do this, and we all do it, right? We have stuff and we're just like, let's put it over here in this folder, right? Do any of you have archive folders where you just put stuff? I have a million of them. How much does the fact that we can all do that, and we all have to, right? We have to organize files on our drives, on our phone. We have to organize things in some way. how much does that make us less critical about what an archive really is or has been? Because it just seems like we can save everything. It's just so easy. There's just no problem there, right? You can literally save everything you do in your life. This is kind of weird to think about. Like if you had to save paper and like every physical artifact, you'd run out of space. You could be a hoarder, I guess, but you still eventually need, storage lockers and then, but you could document, you can save everything you make. You can save every email you write. You can save every email you get. You can save every paper you write for a class, every blog post you write for fun, your digital journal, like everything. You could wear a GoPro camera and film everything you do. You could literally save every second of your existence. You'd have to buy more hard drives and storage space, but it's you could totally save it, everything. So someone 2,000 years from now would be like, what was life like in 2021? And they could just look at your life. I mean, that's pretty amazing to think about. I mean, wouldn't it be cool if we had the Cicero cam and we go to ancient Rome and just see what it was like walking through the forum, talking to, famous emperors or whatever? Do we have that? Are people 2,000 years from now going to look back at us and say, wow, here's what life was like? Or are we still, even though we can save everything, of course, not everybody can save everything. There's not that much storage in the world. But what are they going to see? What videos, what snippets, what sound bites, TikTok, what are they going to see? What are they going to think is typical versus exceptional? We tend to save exceptional stuff. But how do we get access to the typical mundane stuff? And so you think that archives now are sort of enabling that just because it's so easy to save to archive and move stuff into a folder and keep it on a hard drive and move it to a flash drive. You think it's so easy that surely, historians later are going to have this amazing set of stuff. But really, it's still very, very highly selective. But the fact that it's so easy for us personally to archive it makes it a little easier to not think about the problematic nature of archives, even in a digital world, where there's still all these choices and still all this power and control about who decides what to save, what do they decide is important and valuable, and so on. Okay, so archives, I think we've established, not some pristine storehouse of historical documents that's sort of piled up and grows over time, but it's a reflection of and often a justification for the society that creates them. This is true for the data used every day in society. We collect data that justifies the world that we live in and justifies the world we want to live in, excludes people that we don't necessarily care about or decide are less important. The same things you're reading about for archives apply to how modern society is working in terms of data and algorithms and automated decision making and government policy and so on. One of the last points that we get in the archive article is about the rise of professional history in the 19th century, which made science more of a history at the time, a very rigorously researched effort to understand the past, a very antiquated view that we don't really share anymore, but it was certainly revolutionary at the time, and so that it grounded history, the profession, the discipline of history, in archives, in archival sources. Not surprisingly, the professionalization of history, this is around 1850, coincided with the professionalization of archivists. Both archivists and historians working together, not necessarily on purpose, but just sort of because they were working at the same time and were working in the same ways, they squeezed out storytelling, they squeezed out the ghostly and the psychic, they squeezed out the spiritual and the feminine. These are all phrases from the first article you read. And they squeezed out all the amateur women practitioners. A lot of women were writing histories in the 19th century, and so little of that has survived because people deemed it not important to save. We know about some of these women and what they were writing, but we often don't know what they actually wrote because it wasn't important by the people, according to the people who had to save things. What did people save? What did historians want to write about in 1850? Men, right? Pursuing scientific and professional history. That's what the historians were. And the historians and the archivists, what did they want? They wanted to write about national politics, war, administration, diplomacy, the experiences of men in power, great men history, it's often called. They ignored, on purpose, because it just, in their view, wasn't important to catalog or archive or think about the work of families and farms, factories, local communities, right? These things were unimportant in the grand scheme of history to them. Now we can look back and say, well, that was their fault, they were wrong. But we're doing the same things now, not necessarily on the same topics, but we're still making choices according to our own society and our own version of what archives should be, our own notion of what's important. We're still making those choices, and that is clearly shaping the future of people and how their identity gets constructed, how they get represented in government policy, and so on and so forth. Let's move on to interfaces for a minute. A working definition of interface to kind of cobble together some ideas from the first couple pages of the interface article. I think it's useful for us to think of interfaces as shared, permeable boundaries. The archive, there's not just one boundary between sort of the historian and the archive. We need to think of the archive as a complex set of interfaces that separate the past from the present, and therefore, through all of these different interfaces, controls the flow of knowledge, the interpretation of the past, right? This is where power is exerted, in part through these interfaces. The author Margaret Hedstrom mentions early on that interfaces tend to work best when they appear natural. And I think she doesn't make this point, but I want to highlight it here. This is actually part of interfaces' subversive power over their users. Is the more natural they are, the more they easily give an impression of completeness and objectivity and of naturalness, as if they represent the archive itself in a very natural way, and that the archive therefore corresponds to the real world, the past, unproblematically. I used typography as a simile last week. We don't notice archives until they don't work. We don't really notice typography until it's creating some sort of dissonance for us. You could say typography is an interface to the text. We don't notice it, right, unless it's messed up. When an interface doesn't bother you, you don't think about it. And this is very true for digital interfaces to archives, which we'll get to a lot more in a couple of weeks. We do a whole assignment on a digital interface critique of an archive, and so of what it enables and what it doesn't, and so on and so forth. When the interface doesn't bother us, when they become very natural, or they seem very natural, it's easy to be less critical of how the interface is mediating our experience on what's on the other side of that permeable boundary. One thing I want you to keep in mind when you're reading the interface article is the various layers of interfaces that are part of an archive and users and society and so on. The article tends to focus on the interface between the archivist and the archive, and the interface between the archive and the user of the archive. And those are two very important interfaces. They might be the most important, but there's a lot more of them. There's an interface with the physical building, with sort of the storage mechanism, with the way things are cataloged and organized, with the things that the users of the archive produce, whether it's Wikipedia pages or history books or journal articles or movies, whatever. There's a lot of different interfaces going on. So keep that in mind as you're reading, even though she tends to focus on those two main ones. So the second article is really talking about interfaces in the same way that the first article is talking about archives in general. So the first article, we've gone over this, archives yield a tremendous amount of power in the present day, not just about the past, but about sort of contemporary society. The second article is trying to get us to think about how not just the archive, but also the interfaces that are part of the archive are also active participants in knowledge creation. A couple of implications of technology. Archival exhibits, digital archival exhibits, online collections. On one hand, it seems really great that there's so much of this stuff. Like you can find things online that you would never be able to see in person. It's easy to think that this is constant sort of democratization of knowledge, where just more people are able to see more stuff. And to some extent, that is absolutely true. But we also have to keep in mind that these things are expensive. They take a lot of work, they take a lot of time, and there's a commitment to keeping them available, right? When you put something online, it doesn't just stay there magically. Like it takes work. And if somebody cares about it, they can do that work. But over time, what happens to stuff if it's not actively cared for, if it's not in a careful sort of ecosystem where it's taken care of. So these creations, these digital archives that we're seeing so much of now, are very heavily influenced by funders and sponsors' interests and of course, archivists' view of what is and isn't important. And in that same way that we've seen in the archival past, people had to be very selective about what they thought was important. It's easy to think that now that we can save so much stuff, we don't have to make those decisions, but we do. And we're making them, not necessarily in the same way as the past, but we're still having to make those decisions of what's valuable because we can't just put everything online, right? And if we could, we would never be able to find anything. In our digital world, when we want to find information, what do? Well, we Google it, right? First and foremost, just to see what comes up. We know there's more to the story, hopefully. But when we Google for information, we're trying to learn something about history, where do archives and archival documents show up in those searches? It's not just that they're on page 2 or 3, it's that they're on page 200. Like they're basically not there. And this creates a very different sense of what archives are for in the sort of, a general sort of collective understanding of where history comes from. If you never see that, if you see a lot of historical information, but the archives are never really part of that story because they're never showing up on the search results, you never see a historical document. How much does that change our sense of what an archive is and what it's for and how it shapes our understanding of the past and the present? Are people increasingly unaware, because we have so much more historical information available to us, just whenever you want, how much are we more unaware of where to learn about history or where it comes from? How much are we more ignorant about archives? Because it seems like the archives have sort of percolated all this historical information up, and it's at our fingertips, right? What do we really need to worry about archives for? It's all here, right? It's all been interpreted. This creates a very different relationships to archives than people have had in the past, where they knew archives were sources of power, right? We read about this in medieval Europe, Renaissance Italy. People were manipulating archives. They were in the town square. They were central, right? They were seen as justification for who was in power and what was happening. People understood that archive. Not people were going into the archives and looking at stuff, but people knew that's where history came from. That's much less clear, I think, today than it used to be. How much power is granted to anyone who makes an archive of whatever, right? And it might not be a very, carefully collected one. How much power is granted to anybody that can make an archive available and visible and findable? What kind of knowledge is getting sort of not suppressed so much as filtered out through algorithms that allow us to find information now? Another theme that I want to touch on here that you'll see across both readings, transparency. When power is overlooked or unchallenged, or if we don't recognize that archives and social data have tremendous power, it is misleading at best and dangerous at worst. Power recognized becomes power that can be questioned and held accountable. So if we don't see the source of power, it's ever yielding subjects, right? We are constantly at the mercy of archives and what they present and the people that go and use them to tell a particular story, right? And there's no objective past to discover. Remember, people are making what they want out of the archive. We're constantly subject to that unless we recognize what those processes are. The interface article ends with a very nice professional plea that I'll paraphrase here and then explain. Rather than obscuring the interpretive aspects of appraisal, presentation, and mediation, archivists should expose and articulate these interpretive acts, capture and structure information about them, and leave as many traces as possible. Sounds like a forensic game or something. But the point is transparency, right? Archivists should be clearer about what they're doing, what they're discarding, and so on. This sounds nice. I mean, I'm definitely not opposed to it. But I'm not sure if just making archival decisions more transparent really matters. As the interface article notes earlier on, archivists are not the only forces determining what survives. In many cases, they are subject to much larger social, technological, cultural, political, budgetary forces that shape the holding of archives. And archivists themselves, and to some extent archives, are products of their own culture. They're embedded in their own culture. For an archivist to say, here's what I'm excluding, is expecting them to recognize all the things that they're not thinking about, which is kind of impossible. Furthermore, The issue of archival power isn't just in selection, but what's even available for archiving, right? We'll get to that later when we get to community archives in a few weeks. So I highlight this quote because I think it pertains not just to archives, but even more strongly to data and how it gets used in society. So most people use data today as historians have used archives over time, right? People treat data as historians have treated archives, considering them as fairly objective windows onto some reality, whether it's the past or contemporary society or whatever. There's that same kind of layer. So the archival layer, the archival apparatus that allows us to interface with the past. My contention here is that the data layer of society, all the stuff that decisions are based on collected data, is that same kind of layer. It allows us to interface with the present, and it's highly distorted in the same way that archives are highly distorted. So everything we're reading about power and identity and transparency and technology, it's not just about archival history. It's not just about collecting stuff in a storage room. It's about the future of data and algorithms and artificial intelligence. So that's the second half of the class, obviously. So everything we're reading has a future here. So in the end, just to wrap up, the whole point of the week is to understand the constructedness of archives. And same for interfaces. How they are built for particular purposes, how they work in particular ways based on cultural circumstances and values, how they both facilitate and eliminate certain kinds of inquiry. Our goal for this semester is to deconstruct, to take apart the constructedness of archives, to see how they work. Right? When I was a kid, I used to love taking apart watches because I just thought it was so cool, all the little tiny springs and parts and levers and stuff. 0 watches got put back together. It's really hard. Once you take it apart, it's kind of like Pandora's box. It's just out. We're going to do that for archives. We're going to do that for algorithms. We're going to try to take them apart. We don't need to put them back together. We're just trying to understand what's going on inside, and that's the fun part. The prompt for this week is a set of questions, and you're not going to be able to write about all of them. They're pretty broad. They all kind of overlap in different ways, so whether you pick 2 or 3 or 4 depends on sort of how you want to intertwine the answers. I think you should think about all these questions. I think they're very important and central to what we're doing this week. Certainly you don't have space to respond to all of them, your 800 words or whatever. Remember, the goal is to show me that you're doing the reading and thinking about the reading and being able to sort of put the readings together and have some sort of reaction to what's going on. I want to hear your thoughts. I want to hear your thoughts. I don't want you to try to echo my thoughts. Okay, I already know my thoughts. I don't need to see them in your blog post. I want to see what you're thinking, what you find interesting. So I've given you these questions as a way of kind of focusing your attention a little bit. So pick a few that you're interested in. I look forward to reading them. I think you'll find the readings far more accessible than last week's. I think they're really engaging. I hope you enjoy them. Take care.